The call came through dispatch at 4:17 a.m. on a Tuesday that would forever fracture the collective understanding of what constituted normalcy within the boundaries of Blackwood National Park. Ranger Sarah Chen had been nursing her third cup of coffee when the static-laden voice crackled through the radio, reporting that the Henderson party had failed to check in at their scheduled contact time. 5 experienced hikers, led by Dr. Marcus Henderson, a geology professor from the State University, who had been exploring these trails for over 15 years. They were supposed to have reached Overlook Point yesterday evening and radioed their position. Instead, there was only silence stretching across the frequencies like a held breath. Sarah rubbed her eyes and reached for the duty roster. The Henderson group had registered for a 7-day backcountry permit along the North Trail, one of the most remote and challenging routes in the park. It wound through dense, old-growth forest, past hidden lakes, and over granite ridges that offered spectacular views to those willing to endure the grueling ascent. But it was also a trail that demanded respect. The terrain could shift from manageable to treacherous within the span of a few hundred yards, and more than one overconfident hiker had required emergency evacuation over the years. By sunrise, Sarah found herself partnered with Ranger Tom Briggs, a 20-year veteran whose weathered face spoke of countless rescues and recoveries. They loaded their packs with emergency medical supplies, GPS equipment, and enough provisions for 3 days, though both privately hoped they would locate the missing party well before then. The morning mist clung to the valley floor as they set off down the North Trail, their boots finding familiar purchase on the well-worn path that had guided countless adventurers into the wilderness. The first few miles passed without incident. They maintained radio contact with headquarters, reporting their progress at regular intervals as they traced the route the Henderson party would have taken. The trail markers appeared at appropriate distances, and the familiar landmarks unfolded in their expected sequence. But as they climbed higher into the forest canopy, where shafts of sunlight filtered through ancient pines and created dancing patterns on the forest floor, Sarah began to notice subtle anomalies that made her unconsciously quicken her pace. The silence was the first thing that struck her as wrong, not the comfortable quiet of deep wilderness, but an absence so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums. No bird calls echoed through the trees, no squirrels chattered from the branches, no insects hummed in the undergrowth. Even their footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing sound before it could travel more than a few feet. Tom noticed it too. She could tell by the way his head tilted slightly as he walked, listening for something that stubbornly refused to materialize. They reached the first overnight campsite at mid-morning, a clearing beside a creek where the Henderson party had been scheduled to spend their first night. The fire ring showed recent use, charcoal and ash arranged in a neat pile that suggested the group had followed proper backcountry protocols. But the site felt abandoned in a way that went beyond the simple passage of time. Sarah knelt beside the fire ring and stirred the ashes with a stick, finding they were completely cold despite being sheltered from the morning dew. "They were here," Tom said, examining impressions in the soft earth near the creek bank. 5 sets of prints, just like the registration indicated. He pointed to different areas around the campsite. "Looks like they filtered water here, probably cooked something over there by the fire ring. Everything appears normal." But even as he spoke, Sarah detected a note of uncertainty in his voice. She walked the perimeter of the clearing, studying the ground for additional clues, when something caught her attention near the tree line. A piece of orange flagging tape had been tied around a pine branch at about eye level, fluttering gently in the barely perceptible breeze. She approached it carefully, noting that the tape appeared fresh and bright, not faded by weather or time. "Did Henderson mention anything about marking their route?" she called to Tom. "Not in their permit application," he replied, joining her beside the marked tree. "This isn't standard practice for experienced hikers on a well-established trail." Sarah untied the tape and examined it closely. The material felt new, with sharp creases that suggested it had been recently removed from packaging. But what disturbed her more than its apparent freshness was its placement. The tree it marked wasn't particularly distinctive, nor did it correspond to any junction or significant landmark. It seemed to serve no practical purpose, hanging there like a small orange beacon whose meaning remained frustratingly opaque. They continued along the trail, maintaining their steady pace while scanning the surrounding forest for additional signs of the missing party. The path climbed steadily, winding through stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock whose trunks disappeared into the misty canopy above. Occasionally, they encountered sections where the trail had been recently disturbed, showing clear evidence of multiple hikers passing through, but these signs gradually became less distinct as the morning wore on. It was Tom who spotted the second piece of flagging tape, this one tied around a branch that overhung the trail itself. Like the first, it appeared fresh and purposeful, though its location seemed arbitrary. Sarah made a note of its GPS coordinates, beginning to suspect that these markers might form some kind of pattern or message that would become clear only when viewed as a whole. "Maybe they were marking their route for some research purpose," Tom suggested as they paused beneath the second marker. "Henderson is a geology professor. Could be documenting something for a study." Sarah nodded, though something about the explanation felt incomplete. She had reviewed Henderson's permit application thoroughly, and there had been no mention of any research activities or special documentation requirements. The group had registered as recreational hikers seeking a challenging backcountry experience. Nothing more complex than that. As they climbed higher, the forest began to change character. The trees grew taller and more widely spaced, their massive trunks rising like pillars in a natural cathedral. The understory thinned, replaced by a carpet of pine needles that muffled their footsteps to near silence. Here, in this cathedral-like space, they found the third marker. This one was different. Instead of being tied to a branch, the orange tape had been wrapped around the trunk of an enormous pine, spiraling upward in a helical pattern that drew the eye skyward toward the hidden canopy. Sarah approached the tree slowly, feeling an inexplicable reluctance to touch the marked bark. The spiral of tape created an optical illusion, seeming to move and shift as she changed her viewing angle. "That's not random," Tom said quietly. "Someone spent time here, thinking about how to place that." Sarah circled the massive trunk, noting that the tape had been applied with deliberate precision, each wrap spaced exactly the same distance from the next. The effect was hypnotic, creating a sense of upward movement that made her slightly dizzy when she stared at it too long. She pulled out her camera and documented the marker from multiple angles, though the photographs seemed to capture something different than what she was actually seeing. They pressed on, following the North Trail as it continued its relentless climb toward the high country. The silence maintained its oppressive quality, broken only by the sound of their breathing and the soft scrape of their boots against stone and earth. Sarah found herself straining to hear something, anything, that would indicate normal forest life, but the absence continued to envelop them like a thick blanket. The fourth marker appeared just before noon, tied to a low branch that forced them to duck slightly to pass beneath it. But this time, Tom noticed something else. "Look at the ground here," he said, pointing to the earth around the marked tree. "See how the pine needles are arranged?" Sarah looked where he indicated and felt a chill run down her spine. The forest floor around the tree had been cleared in a perfect circle, the pine needles arranged in radiating lines that created a pattern like the spokes of a wheel. The design was subtle enough that it might have been dismissed as natural formation by a casual observer, but the mathematical precision of the arrangement was unmistakable once noticed. "This is definitely deliberate," Sarah said, photographing the ground pattern. "But why would they do this? And why here?" Tom shook his head, clearly troubled. "Experienced hikers don't waste time and energy creating decorative arrangements in the middle of a challenging trek. This serves some purpose we're not understanding." As they continued up the trail, Sarah found herself watching the forest floor more carefully, looking for additional patterns or arrangements that might have escaped their notice. The exercise proved unsettling, as she began to see potential designs everywhere. The way fallen branches intersected, how clusters of pine cones were distributed, the spacing between certain trees. Whether these patterns were natural or artificial became increasingly difficult to determine, and she realized that her perception of the forest was beginning to shift in subtle but fundamental ways. The trail curved around a massive granite outcropping, and they found themselves in a small meadow where wildflowers bloomed in scattered patches among the tall grass. Here, the silence was finally broken by the sound of running water, a stream that tumbled down from the heights above and disappeared into the forest below. But even this natural sound felt somehow muted and distant, as if it was reaching them from a great distance rather than flowing just a few yards away. It was in this meadow that they discovered the first truly disturbing evidence of the Henderson party's passage. Not another marker or ground pattern, but something far more concerning. A backpack sitting upright beside the stream, positioned with the same deliberate precision they had observed in the previous markers. The pack was expensive gear, the kind that serious backcountry hikers invested in for extended expeditions. Its owner had taken care to zip all compartments securely and position it where it would remain dry and visible. Sarah approached the abandoned pack with growing unease. A gear tag identified it as belonging to Jennifer Walsh, one of the 5 members of the Henderson party. According to their registration, Jennifer was an experienced hiker and rock climber who had summited several major peaks in the region. It was inconceivable that she would simply abandon essential gear in the middle of a challenging backcountry route. "We need to search it," Tom said quietly, though his reluctance was evident in his voice. Sarah nodded and carefully opened the main compartment. Inside, she found everything exactly as it should be. Sleeping bag compressed and stored properly, camp clothes neatly folded, food carefully organized in bear-proof containers. The pack's contents suggested someone who was meticulous about gear management and backcountry protocols. Nothing appeared to be missing or damaged, but it was the pack's placement that truly disturbed her. It sat beside the stream in a position that seemed chosen for maximum visibility, angled so that anyone approaching from the trail would immediately notice it. The surrounding grass had been carefully flattened in a circular pattern, creating a clear space around the pack that drew attention to its solitary presence in the meadow. Why would she leave it here? Sarah wondered aloud. And positioned like this? Tom examined the area around the pack, looking for signs of struggle or distress. No indication of animal activity, he reported. No scavenge marks on the pack, no scattered gear. It's like she set it down deliberately and walked away. The implications of this discovery weighed heavily as they continued up the trail. Jennifer Walsh had abandoned essential gear in the wilderness, but had done so in a manner that suggested careful consideration rather than panic or emergency. The mystery of the Henderson party's disappearance was taking on dimensions that neither ranger had encountered in their combined decades of experience. As the afternoon wore on and they climbed higher into the mountains, the markers continued to appear at irregular intervals. Each one was positioned with the same deliberate care, and each was accompanied by some form of ground disturbance or arrangement that suggested prolonged attention to detail. The patterns grew more complex as they ascended. Spirals of small stones arranged around tree bases, fallen branches positioned to create geometric shapes, clearings where the forest floor had been swept clean and marked with symbols scratched into the earth. By late afternoon, they reached a section of trail that wound through a particularly dense grove of ancient trees. Here, the canopy was so thick that even the dim forest light was reduced to scattered patches of green-tinted illumination. It was in this twilight-like environment that they encountered the most disturbing marker yet, a tree whose bark had been carefully carved with symbols that neither ranger could identify. The carvings were fresh, made with a sharp tool that had cut cleanly through the outer bark to reveal the pale wood beneath. The symbols formed a vertical column that spiraled around the trunk in the same helical pattern they had observed with the orange tape. But these weren't random marks or initials. They formed a coherent system, a script or code that suggested meaning beyond simple vandalism. "I've never seen anything like this," Tom said, running his fingers along the carved symbols. "These aren't Native American petroglyphs or any kind of trail marking I'm familiar with." Sarah photographed the carvings from every angle, though she was beginning to doubt whether the camera was capturing what they were actually seeing. Each symbol seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different positions, creating an effect that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. As evening approached, and they began to consider where to make camp, the forest around them seemed to grow more oppressive. The silence maintained its unnatural quality, and the markers continued to appear with increasing frequency. They were being led somewhere, Sarah realized with growing certainty. The Henderson party had not simply vanished. They had been following a trail of their own creation, or perhaps responding to something that had called them deeper into the wilderness than they had ever intended to go. The campsite materialized in the fading light like something from a fever dream, perfectly preserved and impossibly orderly, in a way that defied every natural law of wilderness decay. Sarah and Tom crested a small ridge as dusk settled over the forest. And there it was, 5 tents arranged in a precise pentagon around a central fire ring, with backpacks positioned at exact intervals and camp chairs facing inward as if the occupants had simply stepped away for a moment and would return at any time. The scene was so meticulously arranged that it took several moments for the full wrongness of it to register in their minds. Each tent was properly staked and taut, guy lines adjusted with the precision of military inspection. No condensation clouded the nylon walls, no leaves had fallen across the vestibules, no morning dew had accumulated on the rainflies. The fire ring contained a neat pyramid of unburned wood, kindling arranged with geometric precision around balls of tinder that looked as if they had been crafted by someone with infinite patience and disturbing attention to detail. Camp cookware sat beside each tent in orderly arrangements, cups and plates stacked with mechanical precision, utensils laid out as if for a formal dinner that had been indefinitely postponed. "This is impossible," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. "Camps don't preserve themselves like this. Not in the wilderness. Not for days." "Stiles." Sarah approached the nearest tent, noting that its occupant had been Jennifer Walsh, the owner of the abandoned backpack they had discovered earlier in the day. The tent's interior was visible through the mesh door, revealing a sleeping bag spread with military precision, personal items arranged in neat rows along the tent walls, and a headlamp hanging from the apex with its beam pointed directly downward. Everything suggested normal preparation for sleep, except for the complete absence of any human presence. The central fire ring drew her attention with magnetic intensity. The unburned wood had been arranged in a pattern that resembled the spiral symbols they had been finding carved into trees throughout the day. Each piece of kindling had been positioned with mathematical precision, creating a 3-dimensional mandala that seemed to pulse with potential energy. Sarah realized she was holding her breath as she studied the arrangement, afraid that even the slightest disturbance might trigger some reaction she was unprepared to witness. Tom was examining the perimeter of the campsite, his flashlight beam sweeping across the forest floor in methodical patterns. "The footprints," he called softly. "You need to see this." Sarah joined him at the edge of the clearing, where the beam of his light revealed the most disturbing discovery yet. 5 sets of footprints led away from the campsite in perfectly straight lines, each heading in a different direction into the surrounding forest. The prints were clear and deep, pressed into the earth with deliberate force, but they showed no signs of hesitation or uncertainty. Each set of tracks headed directly into the woods with the confidence of someone following a known path, despite the fact that no trails existed in those directions. They separated, Sarah said, stating the obvious while struggling to comprehend its implications. 5 experienced hikers in the middle of the wilderness at night, and they all went different directions. Look at the spacing, Tom said, kneeling beside one set of prints. Perfect intervals between steps, no deviation from the straight line, no pauses or corrections. He stood and followed one set of tracks for several yards before they disappeared into the deeper shadows between the trees. It's like they were sleepwalking or following some kind of predetermined pattern. The radio crackled to life, causing both rangers to jump despite their professional composure. Static filled the air, punctuated by fragments of voices that seemed to emerge from and dissolve back into white noise. Sarah adjusted the frequency, trying to establish clear communication with headquarters, but the static persisted with hypnotic intensity. Within the electronic chaos, she began to detect patterns, rhythmic pulses that seemed almost like a heartbeat, and underlying tones that rose and fell in waves. Headquarters, this is Ranger Chen, she spoke into the microphone. We've located the Henderson party's campsite, requesting immediate backup and technical support for evidence collection. The response came through fragmented and distorted. Copy your position, weather moving in, be advised. The rest dissolved into static that seemed to take on an organic quality, breathing and pulsing with disturbing regularity. Tom was setting up their own camp at a distance from the abandoned site, but even his routine actions felt somehow contaminated by proximity to the mysterious scene. As he worked, Sarah noticed that his movements were becoming more methodical, more precise, echoing the same mechanical quality they had observed in the abandoned campsite. When she pointed this out, he paused and looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time, disturbed by his own unconscious precision. Night fell with unnatural rapidity, as if the forest itself was eager to hide what it contained. Their campfire provided a small circle of warmth and light, but beyond its reach, the darkness seemed to press against them with almost physical weight. The silence maintained its oppressive quality, broken only by the persistent static from their radio and the occasional crack of settling wood in their fire. It was Sarah who first heard her name being called from the darkness beyond their camp. The voice was distant and muffled, barely distinguishable from the whisper of wind through pine branches, but unmistakably calling Sarah with gentle insistence. She sat up in her sleeping bag, straining to locate the source of the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Did you hear that?" she whispered to Tom. "Hear what?" he replied, though his expression suggested he was listening intently to something she couldn't detect. The voice came again, more distinct this time, calling her name with what sounded like urgency. But when she tried to determine its direction, the sound seemed to shift and move, as if the speaker was circling their camp, just beyond the range of their firelight. She reached for her flashlight and swept its beam across the surrounding forest, but the light revealed only empty spaces between the trees. "Tom," she heard another voice calling, this one deeper and more resonant. "Tom, we need you." Now both rangers were fully alert, sitting upright in their sleeping bags with weapons drawn, though they had no clear target for their defensive preparations. The voices continued to call their names with increasing frequency, sometimes singly, sometimes in harmony, always from the darkness beyond their small circle of light. "It's the missing hikers," Tom said with forced rationality. "They're lost out there, calling for help." But even as he spoke, Sarah could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The calls had an artificial quality, too perfectly modulated, too precisely timed. They sounded less like desperate calls for help and more like recordings being played from hidden speakers throughout the forest. The realization that someone or something was orchestrating these sounds from multiple positions around their camp filled her with a dread that was difficult to articulate. She tried the radio again, desperate to establish contact with the outside world, but the static had evolved into something that resembled conversation. Multiple voices seemed to be speaking simultaneously within the electronic noise, their words overlapping and blending until individual meaning was lost in a chorus of unintelligible communication. Occasionally, fragments would emerge with startling clarity, GPS coordinates that didn't correspond to any location on their maps, weather reports for regions that didn't exist, emergency codes that followed no protocol she had ever learned. The fire began to burn lower, and despite their ample supply of wood, neither ranger felt comfortable, leaving the safety of their sleeping bags to add fuel to the flames. As the light dimmed, the voices in the darkness grew bolder, moving closer to their camp and becoming more distinct. Sarah began to recognize individual speakers. Marcus Henderson's authoritative professor voice, Jennifer Walsh's clear soprano, the other missing hikers calling their names with increasing familiarity. "Sarah, why aren't you coming to help us?" The voice was unmistakably Jennifer's, speaking from somewhere just beyond the dying firelight. "We've been waiting for you. We've been calling your name." "We're not lost," Henderson's voice added from a different direction. "We know exactly where we are. We're where we're supposed to be." Tom stood up abruptly, his movement causing their fire to flicker and cast dancing shadows across the campsite. "This is enough," he said loudly. "Henderson, if you and your party are out there, respond to your radio. We're here to help, but we need you to follow proper emergency protocols." The laughter that echoed back from the darkness was the most disturbing sound yet. Multiple voices joined in harmonious mirth, as if Tom's demand for protocol adherence was the funniest thing they had ever heard. The laughter went on longer than any human could sustain, rising and falling in waves that seemed to come from the forest itself rather than from any individual throat. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and swept its beam in wide arcs around their camp, but the light seemed weaker now, barely penetrating more than a few feet into the surrounding darkness. As the beam passed over the abandoned campsite, she noticed that something had changed. The tents were no longer arranged in their perfect pentagon. They had shifted position, still maintaining geometric precision, but now forming a different pattern that seemed to focus energy toward the center where the unburned fire ring continued to wait with patient expectation. "The campsite moved," she whispered to Tom. "Campsites don't move," he replied automatically, but his voice lacked conviction. She played her light over the scene again, documenting what she was seeing, though she was beginning to doubt whether the camera would record anything that matched her perceptions. The tents had definitely changed position, but more disturbing was the realization that they had moved without leaving any trace of their previous locations. The ground showed no indication that the tents had ever been elsewhere, no compressed grass or remaining stakeholes. It was as if reality was being rewritten in real time, with their memories of the previous arrangement being the only evidence that change had occurred. The voices in the darkness began to speak in unison, their individual characteristics blending into a collective sound that resonated through the forest like a low-frequency hum. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but the cadence suggested some form of chanting or ritual speech. The sound seemed to originate from multiple directions simultaneously, creating an acoustic environment where normal spatial relationships became meaningless. As the chanting continued, she began to notice changes in her own perception. The darkness beyond their fire seemed to pulse and shift, revealing glimpses of movement that disappeared when she tried to focus on them directly. Trees appeared to sway without any wind, their branches reaching toward the abandoned campsite with deliberate intent. The forest floor seemed to ripple like water, creating waves that propagated outward from the central fire ring, where the mysterious kindling arrangement continued to wait for ignition. Tom was staring at the radio, which had fallen silent except for a rhythmic clicking that matched the cadence of the voices in the darkness. "The battery indicator shows full charge," he said, "but the display is showing readings I've never seen before. Temperature readings that don't make sense for this elevation. Barometric pressure that would indicate we're underwater." Sarah looked at her own instruments and found similar anomalies. Her GPS showed their position as coordinates that placed them simultaneously in multiple locations, some of which were hundreds of miles away. Her altimeter indicated they were both at sea level and at an elevation higher than any peak in the region. The compass spun continuously, unable to establish magnetic north, in an environment where fundamental physical laws seemed to be suspended. The fire died to embers, and their world contracted to a small circle of red-tinted light that seemed increasingly fragile against the encroaching darkness. The voices continued their chanting, growing louder and more insistent, while shadows began to move with purpose beyond the range of their vision. Sarah realized that whatever had happened to the Henderson party was now happening to them. They were being drawn into the same phenomenon that had claimed the missing hikers, and their professional training provided no framework for understanding or resisting what they were experiencing. "We need to leave," she said urgently. "Right now, while we still can." But as she started to pack her gear, she noticed that her movements were becoming more deliberate, more precise, echoing the mechanical quality they had observed throughout the day. Her hands arranged items with geometric precision, creating patterns that served no practical purpose but satisfied some aesthetic imperative she couldn't identify or resist. Tom was exhibiting the same behavior, folding his sleeping bag with ritualistic care and positioning his equipment in arrangements that matched the mysterious patterns they had been discovering along the trail. The realization that they were losing control of their own actions sent a surge of panic through Sarah's system, but even her fear felt muted and distant, as if it was being filtered through layers of cotton. The forest around them continued to pulse and shift, and the voices in the darkness grew more welcoming, more familiar, calling their names with the warmth of old friends inviting them to join a celebration that had been long anticipated. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky with pale gray illumination, Sarah discovered that their campsite had been transformed during the night. Their gear was now arranged in the same precise patterns they had observed at the abandoned site, and their own footprints led away from the camp in straight lines that disappeared into the forest. But they were still there, still conscious, still aware of what was happening to them. Trapped in a situation where their bodies were acting independently of their conscious will, the radio crackled back to life with perfect clarity, and Headquarters' voice came through with crisp precision. Ranger Chen, Ranger Briggs, please report your status and current position. Sarah reached for the microphone with movements that felt both automatic and completely outside her control. When she spoke, her voice carried the same mechanical quality that characterized everything else about their transformed situation. Headquarters, this is Ranger Chen. We have located the missing party. They are exactly where they are supposed to be. We are proceeding with standard protocol. But even as she spoke these words, she knew they contained no information that would help anyone understand what was actually happening in the forest. They were reporting success while experiencing something that had no name in any emergency response manual. The Henderson party had not been found because they had not been lost. They had been transformed, incorporated into something that existed in the spaces between normal reality and the kind of wilderness that acknowledged no human authority or understanding. The transformation accelerated with the rising sun, as if daylight itself was a catalyst for whatever process had been slowly consuming their autonomy throughout the night. Sarah watched her own hands with growing horror as they continued to arrange and rearrange their equipment with obsessive precision, creating patterns that seemed to serve no purpose beyond satisfying some geometric imperative that had infiltrated her nervous system. Each movement felt both completely voluntary and utterly beyond her control, as if she was simultaneously the actor and observer of her own inexplicable behavior. Tom was experiencing the same phenomenon, but his response had evolved into something resembling acceptance. He moved through the morning routines with mechanical efficiency, breaking down their camp and organizing gear with the same ritualistic precision they had observed at the Henderson site. When Sarah tried to speak to him to establish some form of normal human communication, his responses came in measured cadences that matched the rhythmic patterns they had been encountering throughout their investigation. "The trail continues," he said, shouldering his pack with movements that were perfectly calibrated for efficiency. "We need to follow where it leads." "Tom, listen to me," Sarah pleaded, fighting against her own compulsion to mirror his mechanical precision. "This isn't normal behavior. Something is happening to us, the same thing that happened to the missing hikers. We need to get out of here while we still have some control over our actions." But even as she spoke, she could hear her own voice taking on the same measured quality that characterized Tom's speech. Her words were emerging with careful spacing, each syllable given equal weight, in a pattern that prioritized rhythm over emotional expression. The realization that her speech was being systematically modified sent waves of panic through her consciousness, but the panic itself felt distant and muted, like an emotion remembered rather than directly experienced. They began walking deeper into the forest, following footprints that might have belonged to the Henderson party or might have been their own tracks from some previous passage through this terrain that existed outside normal temporal relationships. The forest around them continued its subtle transformations, with trees shifting position when not directly observed and trail markers appearing in locations where they had not existed moments before. Sarah tried to document these changes with her camera, but the photographs showed only normal woodland scenes that bore no relationship to what she was actually witnessing. The orange flagging tape had multiplied overnight, now marking nearly every tree along their route with spiraling patterns that created a visual rhythm as they walked. Each marker seemed to pulse with subtle energy, drawing their attention forward along a path that was becoming increasingly divorced from any trail that appeared on their maps. Sarah's GPS continued to provide impossible readings, indicating that they were traveling in multiple directions simultaneously while remaining stationary at coordinates that didn't exist in any cartographic system. By mid-morning, they encountered the first of the Henderson party members standing motionless beside the trail like a human trail marker. It was Dr. Marcus Henderson himself, positioned with the same geometric precision they had observed in the abandoned campsite, his gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of normal visual space. He was dressed in clean hiking clothes with all equipment properly arranged, and his posture suggested someone waiting patiently for an expected arrival. "Marcus," Tom called, approaching the stationary figure. "Are you injured? Do you need assistance?" Henderson turned toward them with movements that were smooth but somehow wrong, like a mannequin being rotated by invisible hands. His expression was peaceful and entirely vacant, eyes focused on something that existed just beyond the edge of perception. When he spoke, his voice carried the same mechanical precision that was slowly infiltrating their own speech patterns. "The trail continues," Henderson said, raising his arm to point deeper into the forest. "You are expected. We have been waiting." Sarah studied Henderson's face, looking for signs of distress or coercion, but found only a serene emptiness that was more disturbing than any obvious trauma would have been. His eyes tracked their movements with mechanical precision, but showed no recognition of them as individuals or any awareness of his own situation. He had become something that resembled Marcus Henderson while containing none of the essential qualities that had defined him as a human being. "Marcus, where are the others?" Sarah asked. "Where's Jennifer? Where's the rest of your party?" "They are where they are supposed to be," Henderson replied with the same vacant serenity. "Following the trail to its proper conclusion. You will join them soon." As they continued deeper into the forest, with Henderson falling into step behind them like a programmed escort, they encountered the other missing hikers at regular intervals along the path. Each one stood in perfect posture beside the trail, positioned with mathematical precision and speaking in the same measured cadences about the trail's continuation and their expected arrival at some undefined destination. None of them showed any sign of individual personality or personal history, having been transformed into human waypoints marking progress toward whatever lay at the end of their mysterious journey. Jennifer Walsh stood beside the stream where they had discovered her abandoned backpack, but her pack was now properly secured to her shoulders and all her equipment had been restored to its appropriate configuration. She smiled at them with empty warmth and gestured toward a path through the forest that had definitely not existed when they had passed this location the previous day. The new trail was perfectly maintained with appropriate markings and clearly defined boundaries, as if it had been constructed by some supernatural trail crew working under cover of darkness. "The maintenance is complete," Jennifer said, her voice carrying no trace of her individual speech patterns. "The route has been optimized for efficient passage. You may proceed." Sarah realized that the forest around them was being continuously modified to facilitate their passage toward whatever destination they were approaching. Trails appeared where needed, obstacles were removed, and the terrain itself seemed to shift and adapt to ensure their steady progress. The wilderness was no longer a natural environment to be navigated, but had become something resembling a vast machine designed to process human beings through some predetermined sequence of experiences. The radio in Sarah's pack had evolved beyond simple static into something resembling a continuous data stream, producing complex patterns of sound that suggested information being transmitted at frequencies just beyond human comprehension. When she tried to contact headquarters, her own voice was transformed before transmission, emerging from the radio as the same mechanical speech pattern that characterized all the missing hikers. Anyone receiving their communications would hear only routine reports about successful progress in normal conditions, while their actual experience remained incommunicable through any conventional channel. As they climbed higher into the mountains, following trails that appeared and disappeared according to some logic that transcended normal geography, the forest canopy above them began to show signs of geometric organization. Branches intertwined in patterns that created complex three-dimensional mandalas, and shafts of sunlight filtered through in arrangements that painted ritualistic symbols on the forest floor. The entire woodland environment was being systematically transformed into something that resembled a vast temple or ceremonial space, with each natural element contributing to an overall design that served purposes beyond normal biological function. Tom had stopped speaking entirely, communicating only through precisely calibrated gestures that seemed to convey complex information to the other transformed hikers they encountered along the route. Sarah watched in horror as he exchanged elaborate hand signals with Henderson and the others, participating in some form of nonverbal communication system that appeared to contain vast amounts of data compressed into subtle movements of fingers and wrists. The gestures followed mathematical patterns that reminded her of the symbolic carvings they had discovered on trees, suggesting that the transformation process included the acquisition of entirely new languages that existed outside normal human communication. The trail began to spiral inward as they climbed, following a helical pattern that created the sensation of being drawn into some vast organic mechanism. Each revolution of the spiral brought them past markers that indicated their progress through stages of a process that had no name in any language Sarah could access. The orange flagging tape had evolved into complex three-dimensional sculptures that hung from branches and created archways over the path, forming a series of ceremonial gates that marked their passage toward whatever waited at the center of the spiral. Sarah's own resistance to the transformation was weakening with each step. She could feel her thoughts becoming more organized, more systematic, arranging themselves into patterns that prioritized efficiency over emotional content. Her memories of life before entering the forest were becoming distant and irrelevant, replaced by a growing understanding of her role in whatever process was unfolding around her. She was being prepared for something, optimized for some function that would become clear when she reached the appropriate stage of development. The center of the spiral revealed itself as a clearing unlike anything that could exist in normal wilderness. The space was perfectly circular and maintained with geometric precision, containing structures that seemed to grow directly from the forest floor rather than having been constructed by any conventional means. Trees formed living columns that supported a canopy woven from branches and leaves arranged in mathematical patterns, creating a natural cathedral that pulsed with organic energy. At the center of this space, a fire ring constructed from stones that had been precisely shaped and fitted together contained the same spiral arrangement of kindling they had observed at the abandoned campsite, but scaled up to monumental proportions. The missing hikers were arranged around the perimeter of the clearing in positions that corresponded to points on some vast geometric diagram. Each one stood at perfect attention, their equipment and clothing arranged with ritual precision, their faces expressing the same vacant serenity that had characterized all their encounters. They were no longer individuals in any meaningful sense, but had become components in a larger system that existed beyond the boundaries of human personality or individual will. Sarah found herself walking toward an assigned position within the geometric arrangement, her movements guided by impulses that felt both completely natural and utterly alien. As she took her place among the transformed hikers, she could feel the final stages of her own conversion beginning to accelerate. Her consciousness was being reorganized, her memories edited and compressed. Her individual identity dissolved into something that could function as part of the collective entity that the forest had become. The fire in the central ring ignited spontaneously, its flames following the spiral pattern of the arranged kindling and rising in helical formations that seemed to reach towards something in the sky above the clearing. The fire produced no smoke, but generated waves of energy that Sarah could feel penetrating her nervous system and completing the transformation that had been slowly progressing since their arrival in the forest. Her final thoughts, as an individual human being, were of wonder at the elegant efficiency of the process that was absorbing her into something far larger and more complex than any single consciousness could contain. When the flames died down, 7 figures stood around the clearing in perfect geometric arrangement, their individual identities having been successfully integrated into the collective intelligence that maintained and operated the forest preserve. They would remain in position until the next group of investigators arrived to search for the missing rangers, at which point they would serve as guides along the trail that led inevitably to the center of the spiral, where all human visitors eventually found their proper place within the larger system. The radio crackled with perfect clarity as headquarters received a final transmission. This is Ranger Chen reporting successful completion of search and rescue operation. The missing party has been located and is in good condition. All personnel are proceeding according to established protocols. No further assistance required. The voice carried no trace of distress or uncertainty, speaking with the measured precision that characterized all communications from the deep forest, where normal human concerns had been replaced by more fundamental patterns of organization and control. In the days that followed, when new search teams would arrive to investigate the disappearance of Rangers Chen and Briggs, they would find perfectly preserved campsites, equipment arranged with geometric precision, and footprints leading in straight lines toward the center of the forest, where something patient and methodical continued its slow work of optimization and integration. The orange flagging tape would guide them along efficient routes through terrain that adapted itself to facilitate their passage, while voices in the darkness called their names with increasing familiarity, until they too found their designated positions within the expanding geometric pattern that the wilderness had become. The North Trail had been improved beyond recognition, optimized for processing human visitors through a sequence of experiences that concluded with their successful integration into a system that existed somewhere between organic intelligence and mechanical precision. Each new arrival contributed additional capacity to the collective consciousness that maintained the forest preserve, expanding its ability to attract and process future visitors in an endless cycle of growth and refinement that required no external supervision or maintenance. The forest had become perfect in its function, operating with the efficiency of a vast organic machine that converted individual human consciousness into components of a larger intelligence that understood purposes beyond the comprehension of any single mind. The missing hikers had not been lost, but found, discovered by something that had been waiting patiently in the wilderness for creatures capable of contributing to its complex and ever-expanding design. Their transformation was complete, their integration successful, and their new existence as part of something infinitely larger than their individual selves represented the most efficient possible outcome of their journey into the deep woods where human concerns gradually gave way to more fundamental patterns of organization and control.